You're listening to the Sketchnote Army Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rohde, the author of the Sketchnote Handbook and the Sketchnote Workbook, and this is the podcast where I chat with sketchnoters and visual thinkers and try to understand what makes them tick. Hey everyone, it's Mike Rohde, and I'm here with Andy McNally. Andy, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing pretty good, making it through wintertime as we record this, and looking forward to spring. Sort of the hope that you hold in the Northern Hemisphere is that spring is coming sooner or later, hopefully.
Yes, hopefully.
How about you? What are things like in Ohio?
Ohio has just been cold this year. We're missing our seasonal snow, but we may get some this weekend, so maybe that'll make up for it a little bit.
Sounds good. Well, Andy, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do so we can meet you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity and have me on the podcast. Well, I'm a freelance illustrator, and then I'm also a lead UX UI design consultant. So sometimes I do work for companies, sometimes I don't. And so that's kind of been the bulk of what I've done for the last more than 20 years. And just recently, I've gone to a little bit more full-time freelance illustration, but still doing some UX UI consulting in there, just to kind of even things out, make sure all the bills paid and things like that. But my heart is obviously in illustration and drawing and sketchnotes. So the sooner I figure out a way to do that for a living, I think the happier I will be.
So it's sort of it sounds like a balance between those two is often based on what are the customers coming and what do they need, right? You maybe can't always determine.
Yeah, and I guess if anything, the last couple of years have proven that sometimes what we thought was going to be stable is been a little bit more problematic, and so it's nice to. It was right at the time the pandemic started. I thought, well, I'm gonna try to do a little bit more illustration free time, and realized that I was picking up work, but it takes a little bit of time for people to think about you differently. They think about you as the UX UI guy, and you've been doing that, and then all of a sudden you say, well, I'm going to be a freelance illustrator, and they're like, oh wait, well we don't have any work for you to do that way. So it's been approaching new clients, new customers, and getting the word out there, and I've learned a ton along the way, like even just social media platforms, like how to better post and things like that. So it's been a fun journey. Like I wish things moved faster, but the lessons I've learned over the last 2 years in trying to do more of a freelance illustration path has been invaluable for the road ahead, regardless if that's working for an employer or working for my projects myself.
I've always found that experimental stuff on the side has always come back into my professional life one way or another. Like back in the day, I got into web design, fooling around with PageMill, if anybody remembers that silly app. But it sort of sparked in me like, wow, I can build stuff and go to it on this browser. And it sort of led to eventually coding to a limited degree and building websites. So that's the space I ended up in, is like you, a user experience designer. So, if you really go back to the beginning, it was sparked by that fooling around with this silly, terrible software.
No, it's a very similar story. I mean, that's sort of the way that I ended up in it too, like building web pages. And then one of the tools back in the day, because it was Macromedia then, not Adobe, was Macromedia Flash. And I saw that,
yes,
oh, wow, I can draw vector things and make them move. And then went around the country teaching that for a while for companies, learning centers, and even had the opportunity at one point. Macromedia wanted me to become an evangelist, but I was making more money than they were offering me at the time teaching on my own. So I turned them down stupidly. Maybe I would have been at Adobe or followed Kevin Lynch to Apple as the head of the Apple Watch. So who knows?
Yeah. Interesting. So tell me a little bit about, you sort of alluded to it in that little story. What is your origin story? Like where did you come from and how did you end up where you are now? Because I think every story that someone has told me has been a winding path and not what they expected.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to start it from the beginning, like I've always drawn. That's been a thing that I've done since I was a kid. My mother's an artist. My younger sisters an artist. Even my daughters have artistic,
Mm.
talents too. So it's something that sort of the family has always done. But I remember being a kid, and my mom was returning back to school to get her degree, and even being sick and going to art class with her at the University of it was Memphis State University at the time. It's University of Memphis now, but I remember going, probably being 4 or 5 to class, and then handing me something to draw, and or drawing, and just being quiet in the corner and drawing and happy. And if I heard the teacher tell the class do something, I would do it too. But it would be any social setting. So that was kind of like the foundation of why I wanted to draw. And if my parents asked me what I wanted to do, like when I was 4, I didn't know what an artist was, so I just said I wanted to be a drawer, because that seemed like the the proper verb that would be associated with that would be what you do. You draw, and you're a drawer. But yeah, so then I found my way into the corporate world, and and coming out of college with an English degree, but not getting a master's or anything else. And so wanting to teach literature, and having talked myself out of doing any art field for whatever reason, and ended up in the corporate world in technology, and then finally found that marriage of probably around 1999 of we can do UX UI, which it wasn't called UX UI at that time, but you can design things, whether it's web pages, et cetera, and kind of marry those two. And that was sort of the lead into finally getting into UX UI in the early 2000s.
Hmm. What about your path into sketchnoting? Is that something you've always done and it's refined, or was it a moment kind of a thing?
It pretty much, like I was talking with my mom about it a couple of months back, and I've always done it. Like I got in trouble particularly in high school, because I was taking notes as one would do in class if you were hoping to, make a good grade. But I always added pictures to my notes, and of course, in high school, especially in the early 80s, that was going to get you in trouble, because I think that teachers didn't have this knowledge of different ways of learning,
Mm-hmm.
especially something more visual and stuff like that. Some of those methodologies came along later in the 80s and the early 90s, and so I would get in trouble, like constantly, like you're not paying attention, you're drawing in your notes. But I persisted anyway, especially after being asked a couple times to repeat what they just said, and I'd repeat it because I was drawing it and
Nice.
writing it at the same time. So it was very much ingrained. And I was a good student too, so they didn't give me too much grief. It wasn't like I was usually kind of a B student. So, but yeah, I've done it for as long as I can remember, and even to like move forward a little bit. So graduating towards the end of the 80s, right around 90s, making it to college, I was really fortunate that a couple of professors, while I was taking notes in a class, and I wouldn't say it was a history class, or it could have been one of my literature classes, but one of the professors, instead of chastising me for drawing and not paying attention, walked by, saw my notes, and said, "Can I borrow this for a second?" And I
Mm.
said, "Well, sure." They held them up to the class, and so I ended up teaching an impromptu workshop, um, which is probably my first time returning the favor and teaching to my fellow students at the university who wanted to come on. We didn't even have a name for it at the time, like, because it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't the concept of sketch notes, but it was just, we called them visual notes, and just how to do that, and was teaching somebody else how to do what I was doing in the class at the time. So it was really nice to see that progress of schools, and to have some really passionate educators who supported it and realized that I was absolutely paying attention, and then to think that other people might value get value of it too, and benefit. So that was the kind of the start of it, and then I just continued to do it, in my professional career. And same thing, people stealing my notebooks in meetings, and running off to show somebody in another conference room or something, and that kind of has always been what I've done. I think it's gotten obviously more refined over the years, and
Mm-hmm.
as my drawings and my illustration skill has sort of progressed too. So the notes have obviously changed dramatically too. And now I now I can sort of see, like, oh, okay, that's me. That's kind of the way I draw. And just like you can with with anybody that's got artistic, whether they're doing sketch notes, or whether they're doing a painting, or whether they're making music, or or whether they're a mathematician, you see them in their work eventually if they
Mm-hmm.
stick at it.
Well, and I have to say that your style is very identifiable. So you've done a great job of making your things look unique. When I'm scrolling through Instagram, like, ooh, Andy did the WWDC or the announcement. Like, I know it's you. It's super clear, which is pretty cool.
Thank you.
Well, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead.
No, I just said, I think it took me some time. Like, I don't even know when it finally came in, but I think slightly before the WWC notes really kicked in. It was probably about 2 or 3 years before that when I'm like, oh, okay, like I really sort of see, because my notes have a slightly different take than just like my illustrations. They're very similar in a lot of ways, but the illustrations are a more refined version. But it was really sort of when I started seeing it and sort of going, okay, this is how I want to do it, because I don't use as much lettering as I really admire some of the lettering, like even yourself, like the variety of lettering and different types of lettering where I may substitute a thickness of a pen for that instead, or occasionally do a block lettering. And I really admire there's so many talented sketchnote artists out there. And this week I've been blessed to have a whole bunch follow me. From one of my latest Apple sketchnotes garnered me about another 30 followers, and it's been fun to follow back and see all their work and to see all the diversity of sketchnoters out there. It's a wonderful community.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And it's good to hear that story again. It sounded like you've been doing this for a long time, and it seems like there's two groups, if I identify. So the one group is, I've been doing this forever and I never knew it had a name. Thank you for defining it, right? So, and then there's other people like, oh, you can do that? That's really cool. Well, I can't draw. I'm sorry, I can't do that. And then convincing them that, yes, you can draw real basic things and it's good enough. And so that's exciting in its own way.
Yeah, I agree. Like obviously from the start of the first time ever teaching some, classmates at the university, that was, like you said, that's the first thing you hear is like, oh, I can't draw. And I'm like, well, you don't have to. That's the wonderful thing. Like, you don't even have to draw a picture to take this stuff note. Like, again, like these people that have this beautiful penmanship and sort of their own typography, skills that they've developed. But it can be so diverse. Like, I'm just amazed at the creativity of the community, and thankful to you too. Like, I remember when I first saw your first book, the handbook, and seeing this and like, oh, this is wonderful. Like, this is such a wonderful tool to be out there and to foster that. But it had been what I had been saying too, and so it was great to see it. Like, no, look, see, somebody else is getting it too. It's like, there's you, it's for everybody. Like, it's as elaborate or as simple as you want to. And I think that the thing that I would say when I would teach it at work or when I was teaching in the university was like, these are your notes first and foremost. Like, it doesn't really matter. It's great if you want to show them and share with somebody, but the important thing is that when you look back on them or you look at the notes, that they make sense to you and you understood what took place in whatever that time frame was, whether it was a meeting, a class, or a conference. You look back at them and you go, oh yeah, and it brings back those memories and you understood what took place. And then the next thing is, if you want to share them, and then you hope that maybe somebody gets some insight out of them too, either by being there with you when they're at the same conference or at the same meeting, or by not being there and they glean some information. A former colleague from one of my last employers, one of my sketch notes I posted this morning, that was one of his comments. He commented on LinkedIn, was this is so insightful, I really learned something. And it was about the iPhone and the first iPhone. I've been doing a kind of a series this week on some of the conversations and innovations that led up to creating the first iPhone, because it was its anniversary of 15 years, which doesn't seem right that it came out. The announcement was 15 years ago this past weekend. And so I kind of got interested into reading some of these articles about that. And he said, oh, this is so insightful. And that's such a high compliment. Like, you're hoping that when somebody sees these, that they get some information out of them, even if it's just smiling. Like, there's a lot of 80s references and inside pop culture a lot of times that I throw in my illustrations when I get a chance, that are in the sketch notes. So even if it's just to make somebody smile, it's heartwarming.
Yeah, even if it makes a little connection that they hadn't considered before, It's sort of that processing you're doing, like, hey, did you know that this is connected to that? And maybe not everybody saw that at first blush. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
So we know who you are. We know how you got here. So tell us, what kind of stuff are you doing these days that you can talk about? Some of it might be private, of course.
Sure. One of the biggest things, like I said, really since about the middle of the first year of the pandemic, who thought we'd be saying, we're 2 years in now.
Are we in the middle? We don't know.
That's a really good question. And I hope we are. Like I hope for all of us we get past this and brighter days are ahead. But I think that we'll make the best of it regardless. But yeah, I decided, like a lot of people, I think at that point, I was leaving the company I'd been with. I'd been working in Washington, D.C. in finance, working for a bank and a team that I dearly loved. And the company decided to take a different direction. And I decided to step back. And I said, well, I'm going to put some effort into illustration and doing a little bit more of that. And so for me, that was really one of the things that I'm most interested in doing and trying to cultivate relationships around doing more illustrations, and oddly, maybe doing some more sketchnoting for companies and illustrators. I got Tony Fidel to like one of my posts this week.
Really?
Saying, hey,
that's big.
I see that book coming out. I said, let's do an illustration next time of your technology adventures, and he liked it. So I'm taking that as a maybe. Like, I think that's the things I'm trying to get more contacts out there, and and meanwhile still just working on UX UI stuff. Also, I launched a newsletter, which got interrupted a little bit this year. I had a good start going. It was a weekly newsletter, which was kind of just a hodgepodge of illustrations and things I'd found insightful during the week, whether it was movies, shows, books, podcasts, that sort of thing. And I'm about to start that back up. It got interrupted. Sadly, we had some international travel. My mother-in-law passed away, and so that kind of broke up our year. And being in Brazil for a month and a half this year, my wife even longer over the series of the pandemic and caring for her mother. And so the good thing about that pause, though, it's sort of like finding. Obviously, we miss my mother-in-law dearly, but it made me actually step back from even the newsletter, which I'm going to start back up, and say, really, my intention for the newsletter was for it to be a sketch note. And I'm using Substack, and so I've been kind of worried that making it too image heavy, like how do I balance it out? But that's really sort of the goal, is to make the newsletter really more of a hand-drawn newsletter, but make sure it doesn't go straight to spam, because it's all image. So I'm going to have to play with it a little bit more. But it was image heavy to begin with. But I really think that the next version, and I'm hoping to have a small version of it out next week and in the weeks to come, is to kind of make it more of a sketch note sort of, and include more of that world inside of there. As I've enjoyed embracing that, and often when I travel, I take notes when I travel to sketch notes, and so it kind of brought it back to me. Like, yeah, you need to. It doesn't have to be. Some of the illustrations originally were a little bit more too illustrative and too refined, and that took a lot of time and effort. And I think bringing it back down a level, especially with some of the digital tools that I'm using to do some of the sketch notes, makes it easy to share and faster in some ways too. So that's one of the things I'm working on. I'm working on some Skillshare classes.
Nice.
So which is I put in some equipment and bought a nice microphone and things like that. I'm still super apprehensive about having my face on the camera for very long, but as my mother said, Mom didn't really say it, so forgive me, Mom, if you heard this. It's an old quote that says, you've got a face for radio. So that's what I always feel like whenever I have a camera turned on. Like I don't want the camera in my face. I don't mind talking, but I don't want the camera. So yeah, I'm thinking about doing some SketchNote classes on some of the software that I use, and then maybe even some on sketchnoting too. Like we'll see, drawing. But that's some of the things coming up, and I've got some cartoons in the work too. I've been an amateur cartoonist all my life, and so I've got about 8 different sets of characters that I've got some loose stories around, and now it's just sort of trying to push a couple of them forward. So some of those may make it into the newsletter, and hopefully the newsletter crowd will give me some feedback on the ones they think have interest and room to move forward.
Well, we'll have to make sure and get links for all these things. We can put them in the show notes
Sure.
so someone wants to take a look. I wanted to mention, for those who aren't nerdy about Mac stuff, Tony Fidel is the guy who designed the iPod. Well, part of that team, but sort of the lead of that team. So you can imagine when the designer of the iPod responds and likes your work, that's big.
Yeah, yeah. He actually liked two different replies this week of mine, which was and it, again, he's jokingly called the Podfather because
Yeah.
he's the kind of the team that brought us both the iPod and the first iPhone too, inside of Apple, and he went on to go to Nest after leaving Apple, and he's had an amazing career. But somebody had made a comment on one of the threads when I did this sketch note commemorating. I basically went back and watched the original Steve Jobs keynote presenting the iPhone for the first time from 2007, and I went back and sketchnoted as if I was sitting there, which I did oddly watch the thing back then, and so it was really nice to watch it again and still be amazed at how amazing the technology was and still is at this moment. And so I posted that on Twitter, and somebody just said, "I'm not an iPod person," because I mentioned the iPod being one of their milestone achievements. And so I stood up for the iPod and said, look, the iPod for at the time and is an amazing device that was, groundbreaking. And he liked that. And then so I thought, why not? So when I tweeted a later thing about him that has him in my sketch note, I said, "Hey, I see you've got a new book coming out, Build, which I think is due out in March." I said, "Let's do one that's illustrated, And so that's how I liked it. So it's super flattering, and if nothing else, that my accomplishments for the week are done. I don't have to do anything else this week besides timing it off with appearing here on the podcast. Like it's been an amazing week. So
That's really great. I think interesting, just to kind of veer a little bit on technology, but I think it relates to sketchnoting too, is often when we look at the past, specifically in technology, but other stuff too, we put it in the context of the way things are now and lose track of what it was like back then. So the iPhone in its context in some ways was less powerful than some things, but radically new in other ways, like no keyboard and the idea of pocketability and all these different things. Same thing with the iPod. There was a documentary, which I'll find a link to, about the Handspring, which is a Palm product, which I was deeply into at the time. And they did The Verge, I think, did a video on like how radical the Handspring was for its time context. Like nobody was doing things like that other than maybe Game Boy or something, right? So it's always good to remember in the context of that time and everything else that's going on, what was it like comparatively? And I think we can also do the same thing with sketchnoting, like looking back. I did this on World Sketchnote Day a few days ago, looking at old books of my very first sketchnotes and looking at like, oh, these are, what was I thinking, right? But it's such a necessary step forward for that time to get to where I am now. So I appreciated that I could see where I was then and how far I've come and how my thinking has changed. And yet some of the foundational things are all there. So it's pretty interesting to always put it in context. I think that's really important.
I think that's excellent advice. I was interviewed by Concepts app a couple months back, and they featured me as a Concepts app creator, and they asked me, kind of to your point, like what's one of your words of advice? And I said, well, one of the things I recommend is looking back at your sketchbook and your drawings, and the same thing with your sketch notes too, is like looking back, because I try to make a practice of it every week or two, and obviously you're looking at the sketchbook or the drawing book that you have, but like you say, looking at some older ones, and like I said, there's some that you're going to cringe at, but then there's some too that like I look at and I'm like, I don't know how I drew some of those things.
Yes.
Like I look back and it gives you that sort of confidence to go forward. Like I drew that. Like there's some of the stuff that you're going to find yourself supremely proud of. You look back on it, and there's certainly going to be learning opportunities too. Like, oh, I'm glad I changed this or changed that. But I think there are those moments when you look back and you're like, oh wow, I'd forgotten I'd forgot that I did this or that thing or this or that way, and I'd like to maybe reinvest some time in that again, or or just being proud of those moments as you look back and remember it. And I think it's a great practice because it's easy to sort of like get down on yourself or things like that, as we
Hmm.
all do from time to time. And there's nothing better than getting a boost from a friend or something like that. But there's also sort of this mental boost of looking back at yourself and going, wait a minute, like I've already done these things. It's sort of like the Harry Potter. I rewatched those movies, and when he does the Patronus to get rid of the Minners in the one scene, I'm geeking out on people in Harry Potter, but he's like he'd already seen himself do it because they did, before, and so he knew he could do it. It's sort of such a wonderful analogy of like looking back at your sketchbook, like going, wait a minute, I've been able to do these things before,
Hmm.
and I think giving yourself a boost of confidence is an amazing thing.
Hmm. That's a great way to think of it. And referring back to looking at old sketch notes, I was looking through these books. One of the ones I was super proud of was I was on a work trip for a design project. Um, I had two colleagues from work with me in San Francisco. We were in the Bay Area at Berkeley. And we said, hey, let's see if we can get into Chez Panisse, which is this really wonderful restaurant that's hard to get into. Well, we couldn't get into the restaurant, but we could get into the cafe, which is sort of like a building next to it or an overflow, or I don't know exactly what it is. And we got in, and I had my little notebook along and a gel pen, and I captured the dinner. And so when I looked at it, I was like, wow, I remember doing that, and I'm so proud of how it turned out. And apparently I wasn't aware of it, but the waiter was kind of circling and watching, and finally came over and asked to see what I was up to, and was really impressed that I'd captured our meal in this really concise way. So it's one of my favorite sketch notes of all time, and to see it again and see it like in the flesh and like in the paper was really fun. So I can echo that
Okay.
feeling of confidence, like that was cool.
Yeah, yeah. Regardless of whether it's just the remember you can do things, but like you said, the beautiful thing about sketchnotes is it captures such distinct moments in time.
Hmm.
Whether it's this wonderful meal that you had, or whether it's a conference, or whether it's a class, or travels. And I think that it's such a wonderful thing. I went to yoga teachers training
Hmm.
back in 2007. And I took a journal and sketchnoted my teacher's training journal, and everybody's like, "You need to publish this." So I have not yet. It's sitting on the shelf back here,
Hmm.
pestering me to do it. I think my anatomy skills aren't good enough to draw yoga poses, but maybe one day.
Well,
So,
you'll have to check out Eva Lotta Lamb has some yoga notes that she's produced, little books
oh,
to draw poses in really simple ways. So they're using really simple uh, people poses to do all these. So that might be something for you to peek
yeah,
into,
for
and I'll
sure.
put a link in the show notes for that too.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So because we mentioned before, are we in the middle of the pandemic? Hopefully near the end. What are some things you've been doing to cope with either being locked down or not doing the things you normally do? What have you replaced that with to keep your spirits up?
Yeah, like you said, it's who knows where we are in terms of this. But obviously, no surprise that drawing is played a big part of mine. I've actually drawn more. Last year was
Hmm.
the first time that I'd filled up a humongous big sketchbook in one year. Like it was one succinct year, and I was really proud of that fact. And it wasn't even all the drawings. Like I added almost like Austin Kleon style. There's things from other journals and stuff that I taped and put in there too. So I'm sure I'm not going to weigh mine like he does at the end of the year, but I'm sure this one weighs more than it weighed to begin with. Because I do have like a work sort of notebook that ends up having drawings in it too and stuff. But if I'm at a meeting with a client or something like that, it ends up
Hmm.
having visual notes in it as well too. So that's obviously the one thing is just drawing more. But some of the other things that I've done for me, I've been reading books that I enjoyed growing up, whether it was going back and reading Blade Runner, Do Androids Dream of Electric
Hmm.
Sheep was one of the things that I reread, and but things like The Hobbit, so just finding time to read books, occasionally listen to audiobooks if like I'm going for a walk or something like that, and listening to them there. So that's been really one of the things that we've done, as a household. Because my wife's a professor, so she reads a lot, for work too, but these are trying to read for enjoyment as well. And then obviously not being able to see family as much as we could, so using the best of technology and Zoom and all that to see each other virtually when we can. Matter of fact, my mother's the first one to fuss at me like, you haven't FaceTime me this week, and so she'll fuss at me if I go too long just calling her audio call and haven't FaceTimed her. So just doing things like that, I think have really kept everybody close, and then kept our minds in positive ways. Finding distractions, whether it's drawing or good books.
That's great. That's great. I think something simple like reading is just so great. I've sort of gotten back into reading for pleasure again in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Stumbling into like a book series like The Expanse, which is a sci-fi series, which is also now a TV show. Reading old books, like typically about 3-4 years I'll read Lord of the Rings, right? So that's due pretty soon. And some other books that I enjoy, and just reading it to unwind at the end of the day. Not reading for learning, but reading for getting sucked into another world for a little while. That's really nice to do. That's a good reminder.
Absolutely. Like you say, I think that so many of us in our careers read only for work or things like that. And it is such a, like you said, it's such a nice thing to read for an enjoyment, whatever your mode of literature is, whether it's fiction, science fiction, classics, romance, mystery. I think it's such, like I say, it just takes you away for a little bit and gives you a nice journey.
This episode of the Sketchnote Army Podcast is brought to you by Concepts, an infinite canvas sketching app built for tablets with a stylus, like the iPad Pro, Microsoft Surface, and Samsung Galaxy Tab. Concepts' infinite canvas lets you spread out and sketch in any direction. Everything you draw in Concepts is a flexible vector, so you can move your notes around the canvas or change their color, tool, or size with a simple gesture. Search Concepts in your favorite app store for infinite, flexible sketching. And on that note, let's switch topics to tools, one of my favorite parts of the podcast. We'll start with analog first, so that's pens, pencils, notebooks, paper, whatever. And then you can switch over to any digital tools you're using to do your work.
Sure. Well, to go along with that, like I resisted digital and we'll get to digital in a minute, but I resisted digital for a long time because I'd always done my sketch notes traditionally. And so all the Apple WWC were traditionally done. And, obviously took photos of them after the fact. And I started getting chastised in the last couple of years for not doing it on an iPad Pro. But so, yeah, for me, like there's something very tactile. So I draw analog every day, even if a project turns out to be digital later on. But, I think every artist probably is particular about their pen. So I'll start there. And some of mine will make sense because I was traveling so much doing this for a little bit and traveling for work. I tried to find some tools that I thought I could find anywhere in case I forgot them, lost one. Even I could find it just a drugstore, something, in San Francisco or wherever I might happen to be at the time. So one of them that I use is my favorite tool is a Papermate Big Flare, just felt tip marker.
Great pen.
And that's probably, it's just classic line. You can get different thicknesses out of it, especially when they're brand new. You can get really fine things. Maybe not so much after using it for a while. So that's often my thick line. And then I use 2 pens for my thin line. The travel one is just the Sharpie pens, because again, you can find them just about at any drugstore or any convenience store along the way. And that's been a staple one, and that's usually one of my thinner lines. Even though sometimes I may use there's a medium and a regular sort of width to them. And then this one I had to look up on the internet how to pronounce. This is one of my favorite new pens. And so I apologize in advance to any Japanese listeners if I do not pronounce this right, but I believe it's called Fude no Suke. Fude no Suke. It's a brush pen, and I prefer the hard tip brush pen. And it gives me just a wonderful thin line, but because of the brush, even though it's a hard tip brush pen, it's just a beautiful consistent line, and it's one of my new favorite ones because it does give me some varying widths. whereas the other two are kind of more of a consistent width,
Right.
unless you go back over the line. So I do love it. I do recommend it. I want to say that as an artist I follow online that turned me onto this one, and so I ordered it during the pandemic. So I've only been using it for about a year and a half now, but it's one of my new favorites for sure. And they're pretty easy to come by. You can find them on Amazon. So those are my pens, that I'm passionate about. And then for sketchnotes, really, I've used the same notebook for years now. And part of it was because I was traveling for work as UX UI designer. I was going to these conferences, so I wanted something that would fit in the bag with my laptop flat. So I use the Moleskine cashiers. So it's the extra large cashiers, and it's kind of like a almost tan sort of paper, which I wash out with like a filter to make it look a little bit more white whenever I take pictures of it. But and then usually I'll just find a piece of scrap lined paper behind it to kind of give me some guide. So it's sort of my blotter page underneath. So that's one of my tips and tricks as a secret. Everybody's like, how do you stay online? Well, I don't always stay in line, but that's one of the tricks, is to put that, just like a piece of lined paper underneath to keep it from bleeding into the next page anyway, especially when you put the markers down. And I didn't mention the markers. I'm not really passionate about any particular markers. I do like Pantone markers and do like Copic markers. But I also like the Blick studio markers. So I don't think about coloring my sketch notes while I'm drawing them, with one exception. I usually keep a 30 or 20% gray, either a cool or warm gray, and that's all I do is maybe underline, shadow, or highlight when I'm drawing, and then I'll come back after the fact and add color details later on with more markers. And it's been really for twofold, because I don't want to get too carried away in the drawing, so I don't want to lose, especially if I'm at a live event, I don't want to lose track of what they're saying, and stay on sort of task. I think it kind of helps me do that. But yeah, I'm not as precious about my colored markers, but I do like Copic, I do like Blick. So
It's interesting when I look at the work. It does seem, now that you've said this, it's primarily white. You have a really good handle on white space use.
yeah.
Single line, or black and white line, maybe with gray, and then some highlights of color. So the color really augments the structure in the black and white. It's not the primary thing about your sketch notes, the way I perceive them. And that would make sense too, that by making those highlights, you could separate the two tasks, right? You could do the sketch notes in black, maybe with gray if you wish, and then next week, next month, 2 days, you could come in and do the highlighting in a separate pass, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, for me, like I said, I think that going back to one of the things, obviously, that you say, and I quoted you this week when I did like a little one-page sort of like sketchnote cheat sheet. It's about the ideas and not the art. And that said, like, there's nothing wrong with embellishing and adding things, but I think that some of that needs to come after the fact, especially live events. So if you're capturing a live event, WWCs, I was drawing on the back of my iPad. Like, I had the notebook sitting on that in my lap, and sometimes in these different places. And if you get too heavy into the drawing, as we want to do, like sometimes you have this idea, you're like, oh yeah, I've got to get this. This has got to get on there. You'll get carried away, and you look at me like, wait a minute, what did they say? What was like, it's 5 minutes later and you lost track. So early on, I learned to like, okay, like, make sure you draw quickly, and you can always come back to it. And I think that's that's kind of one of the important things to kind of consider as you do that. Obviously, if you watch a recorded thing, you can take your time. And that said, going back to that WWC for a minute, the new ones, actually, I'm really glad they're not in person, because the new video presentations of the keynote are pre-recorded, and they're so fast beat, as in beat, 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 beat. They are hard to sketchnote. Like, I'm thankful that they're actually videos, because they're hitting you with so much information so fast that I think sitting there in person, it might be a bit hard to keep up with them, that they're coming at you so quickly.
That's an interesting observation, that it's almost like the production values are so good.
Yeah, production value is really good. There were natural pauses in the live events, whether it was changing from a speaker walking out on stage, whether it was them walking back over to get a drink of water because they don't take a drink of water in
Yeah.
the videos because they don't need one, and so they're beautiful presentations, but man, they are for sketchnoters. Anybody wants to go watch one of them because they're all free on, especially the developers' websites, stuff like that. Go look at them and see if you think what I meant, and then go back and watch one from before the pandemic and see if you recognize that there's maybe a little bit slower pace to the ones before. Still excellent quality in all of them, but yeah, different concepts.
That could be a high level challenge for someone who wants to really test their skills. Is
Oh my God.
compare yourself on these really tightly edited, high production values. Like the
Absolutely.
espresso of announcements, kind of a thing. It's not a pot of coffee.
I know.
They've compressed it.
My wife's the coffee drinker. I don't drink coffee, and so maybe if I have to do something high production value, maybe that's what I need to do is drink coffee.
So let's switch to
Digital
your
tools.
digital now.
Yeah, so digital tools, no surprise, being an Apple fanboy, I use an iPad Pro, and it's last year's model, which I can't remember which actually one is right this second, but I use the smaller 11-inch one. Like, I love
Yeah.
the big one, but because before the pandemic, I'd been traveling, I'd always used it because it was easier to carry it in my MacBook in the bag together, and my sketchbook. So use that with the Apple Pencil, of course, and then I have a curve on the software. I don't use Procreate, which everybody assumes that I
Interesting.
do.
Yeah.
I use Concepts app, and being an illustrator and having used Adobe Illustrator and vector tools for 20 years now, more than that actually, I love that Concepts is vector based, and they've got so many different pens or brushes that you can buy. And there's one that's actually a felt tip marker, and actually it leaves too much of a break. They have one that's called a gel pen, but it leaves enough rough edges that it sort of mimics my Bic flair in a really nice distinct way. But I've gone back and actually used some of my sketchnote stuff and isolated it out and then made it into some of my t-shirt designs and stuff like that, because the tool is so flexible and so wonderful to use. I use it very much the way that I would use Photoshop. Like, I don't let it, even though it can, Concept has this really wonderful feature where if you pick up a different tool, brush, it'll keep that on a different layer from you. And I'm in such a habit of doing that. I actually separate everything out. I know that I'm going to do pretty much my outlines first, and they'll be on their own layer with the text, and then I'll do the color separate, almost the same. Like, it's sort of a digital way of doing my analog style, and so that way it's kind of nice, it's succinct. And then that's been the switch. Like, really, when the pandemic started was when I made the switch to doing sketchnotes digitally. Oddly, it was pretty infrequent before that I did them, but Concepts, I've used them for a really long time, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I had the benefit of being featured as a creator of theirs, because I use them both now for some of my illustration work as well as my sketch notes. And I recommend everybody giving them a try. They've got a couple different models. I think they have I'm from the old school. Like, I actually bought it and I paid for my brush packs, and but now there's this subscription model too. And I think that with the base, there's still some free pins and stuff like that. Some of the ones I use the most are in the free set. Like, there's a fixed width pin. I use it. It's in the free set. There's a dotted line that I love for motion because I'm sort of retro Hanna-Barbera inspired artwork, and so that dotted line reminds me of the cartoon retro style. So
Nice. And so you sort of alluded to it. I wanted to specifically ask, on the digital stuff, are you trying to recreate the look and feel of the analog? So if someone were to look at the two, it might be hard for them to determine where you would know?
yeah, I'm not trying to 100% replicate it, but I do like the feel of it. I don't want it to be where my illustrations are more clean and polished, sort of more your traditional vector with clean edges. I don't want that. And I felt like the first couple of times that I originally started to try to do, I used the tool that Adobe's retiring actually the next couple of weeks. I forget what it was, and it seemed too clean. I forget what it's called right this minute. Like
Adobe Sketch or something? Or Adobe Draw, maybe.
I think it was Adobe Sketch. Yeah, Rob Generetti, one of my friends, amazing Adobe Sketch illustrator. If anybody look him up, he does work for ESPN and
Mm,
you name it. He's a big sports fan, and he used that tool, and I would look at it and see him use it. And the way I looked and did it for sketchnotes, and it's like night and day. But it seemed too clean when I did it.
mm,
Like for me, for my sketchnotes, like the lines were too crisp, too clean, and that's one of the things that I really loved about Concepts was it allowed me that flexibility, just like you could do really with Procreate too. Um, with Procreate, you can choose so many brushes out there, and you can make it look crisp, clean. You can give it more of a sort of an analog feel. But for me, like it felt more like me once I found that I could
mm.
get a brush and it had a little bit of grit to it, and then just loved the flexibility of it being vector and being able to export it at
Yeah,
different scales and sizes and repurpose things. So yeah, I think for me, I do want it to look a little bit analogish. It's still for me like it's no problem for me to look at one and know which way I did one
yeah.
versus another. Like there's just such a distinct feel of a pen on paper.
Hmm. Interesting. I'm a fan of concepts. I don't use it a ton, but I use it more for illustration work. And I think
Mm.
I've told this story a few times before in the podcast. I had a customer who hired me to do a drawing for a big board, and I thought, oh, concepts, because it's vector, they can scale it up.
Yeah.
So I did this whole drawing and did it in a kind of a pen layer, and the client looked at it and said, oh, it's too perfect. We want it to look like it's rough and like a architecture. Like, oh, great. So I thought, well, I got to redraw this thing. I'm like, wait a minute. I wonder if I could change the strokes to a different
Oh
pen.
yeah.
And so I took a little chunk and selected it and switched it to pencil. Like, ooh. And
Oh,
basically
I know.
spent about an hour just selecting objects, turning it to pencil, tweaking it a little bit, and then adding some things. Client loved it. And I probably
I know
saved,
that.
geez, 6, 8 hours, 10 hours of work.
Oh yeah. At least to your point, like that's one of the beautiful things is you can change the pen after
Hmm.
the fact. And the other thing too that will probably be in the class I teach because one of the classes hoping to teach for Skillshare will be one on concepts and using
Mm,
it specifically for sketchnoting and illustrating and then maybe repurposing it. Is I love the ability to change the pen after the fact, but you can also change the degree of correctness that you want concepts to
yeah.
apply to it. That is to say that you can let it be completely loose and hand drawn the way you drew it, but you can also clean it up after the fact, an individual line or an entire group of lines, and that's pretty powerful too. Like that's
Hmm.
some nice things. Because occasional times when I'm drawing it, I'm like, I don't want that to be quite that bumpy. Like I'd like for it to be a little straighter, a little cleaner, and just select it and applies whatever percentage of correction you want to in terms of cleaning it up. It can get a bit aggressive,
Yeah.
but there are ways around that.
Hmm. Well, that's a really good testimonial for concepts. I think definitely people should have multiple tools in their tool belts, right? Sometimes there's a call for,
Yeah, absolutely. Play.
you know,
That's that biggest thing is like just play with tools and see what resonate. Like you never know what'll resonate with you. Like um, I've used so many out there. I do love the iPad, so I do gravitate towards trying to use things that work on the iPad.
hmm.
And I've used for some of my illustrations, I use Vectornator, which they've been really kind to reach out and featured me to in an article. And Vectornator is more what I call traditional, sort of like Adobe Illustrator, but
Right.
a little bit too clean when I would try to do a sketch note with it. I did one with it, and it kind of reminded me of the old Adobe product. It's like, wait a minute, this is too clean, but I do really
Hmm.
like this tool for vector illustration.
Hmm. Interesting. Let's shift a little bit to tips. So this is the time where I
Sure.
have you sort of give 3 tips for someone who's into visualization, whatever that means to them. Maybe they feel like they've hit a plateau and they need a little inspiration. What would be 3 things you might share with them?
Sure. And some of these are going to sound anybody that's seen my Instagram feed. Some of these were probably mentioned in my tips, sketchnote tips post. But the first one that I recommend is especially like when you're thinking about the drawing aspect of it. I think that most of us have a handwriting and our handwriting is distinctly ours. But when we're trying to think about drawing and obviously it's ideas and not art, but it's remembering to break things down into their basic
Mm,
shapes, circles, squares, etc. And one of my all-time favorite references and um, artists that I admire for that has actually books on these that are kids' books. I'm going to say that they're not kids' book, but it's the artist and author Ed Emberley, and he has
Yep.
these books on drawing, and where he takes it's Ed Emberley's Draw World, and there's I forget how many there are. There's like 8 or 9 of them, and he breaks things down. Like, all right, I'm going to start with a circle, and then I add a square, and it's just this perfect tool. I have at least 7 of them on my
Mm.
shelf over here, and I will often, if I know that I'm going to a conference to sketchnote, one of those is going in my suitcase or bag with me, just so that when I get a little bit overwhelmed right before I get there, because like when it's sort of that performance of like I've got to
Right.
capture this event and I've been hired to do it. I'll look at one of those just as a reminder, even though none of it may be anything that I'm going to draw. It's just like, oh yeah, it's shapes. Like just break it down. It's lines, shapes, squiggly lines, filled in lines. So I think that that's
Mm.
definitely look up Ed Emberley if you don't know who he is. His books are wonderful. He's an amazing artist, inspirational too. So basic shapes, remember that. That's tip number one. Um, Tip number two, um, and I mentioned this a minute ago when I was talking about my style, and hopefully maybe this resonates with with others, is to remember that you can add details and color later. Focus on capturing whatever it is, whether it's where you are right at the moment. Try to capture the information, the details, the important objects. Too, if it's something you're trying to capture in terms of drawing. And remember that you can add details later. And one of the things too that I found about that technique of doing that, of adding details, embellishments, and color later on, is it also gives me a minute to go back and review the note too.
Mm.
Like it's this wonderful way of going back and rethinking, and then maybe adding something because your mind is triggered by looking at it. And especially like for students, this is an excellent way to review your class notes. Like
Yes.
for me in college, that was when I was going back and adding colors, and occasionally I would completely redraw the note because I was about to take a test or an exam. It was a way for me to recall the information and remember things that I either left out, forgotten, or omitted, or to just spend more time drawing or doodling and thinking about that visual that wanted to go with it, because that cemented the idea in your head even more succinctly at the time. So I think for me it became both a necessity just in the way, because I do write really slow. I know that when
Mm.
I can draw much faster than I can do my handwriting, and so it allowed me moments later to kind of catch my breath. And that would, when I was at the WWC, when they were showing a product video, I would stop for a minute and look down, because product video, it was just marketing. No offense to the Marcom team at Apple, they're wonderful, and I'm friends with many of them. But that was my moment in person to take a break and look down and make sure that I got everything that I needed to capture for a second, was when they would show product videos and commercials.
Mm.
So because I could watch those later. So um, tip number three, and I've got one fourth, a bonus tip, if you will. But tip number three is don't be afraid to leave blank space, or a space blank. And this is twofold. Like white space is important, I think, for composition, especially those of us that are designers who've done that for a trade. We know the importance of allowing things to breathe. But then there's a second thing too. I would occasionally know what I wanted to draw for the sketch note, but I knew that I might need something to look at just for a second. Like, even though I knew it was going to be simple, I might need a reference. And so occasionally I'll have a pencil with me when I'm, especially at a live event, and I'll just sort of make a circle covering the space I want to cover, and then make a quick note in pencil so that I can erase it later on. Let's say that I drew Dr. Evil in a sketch note a few years back. I don't remember actually what it was for, but I knew that I couldn't remember exactly what Dr. Evil looked like, but I knew that I wanted Dr. Evil in there. And so I just put a big circle there, and I put Dr. Evil and left it blank because I knew that I wanted to fill that in later on. And so it's like, not, don't be afraid to do that for that reason too. Like you can come back to this, because the important thing is you keep up with what the speaker's saying or what's going on, and you can fill that in after the fact. And then just noticing too, like, okay, maybe leaving some room for things to breathe, whether it's a heading, a title, whether it's something that you've added to embellish. Just it's okay to leave a little space around there. And then my bonus tip, which actually isn't um, really related to the sketch notes themselves, but it's really sort of some of the things that you and I have talked about in our journeys along the way is just keep learning new things. Like we were talking about the software just a minute ago. Like try out new stuff. Like you never know what's going to resonate with you. Like I didn't know when I ordered the pen from Japan whether I was going to like it or not, but I thought I want to try this. Like it looks interesting. And the same thing for software too. Like I've been pleasantly surprised by things, and whether it's technology, books, articles, things like that. And I think that hopefully with sketchnoting, I think that a lot of us are learners. It seems like there's a common thread throughout the sketchnote community that we're all often interested in these things that we're capturing, and we're going to gravitate toward those. Obviously, we're sometimes hired to do things that are outside of our fields, and we get to capture them. And the beautiful thing about that is we get to learn about something new. And so, yeah, keep learning new things. Whether it's book, software, tools, whatever.
Those are great. 4 great tips. You could probably even take the learn new things to the level of putting yourself in places like maybe you do the Apple keynotes because they're hard and see how you fare, right? Or I'm really into this thing, so I'll take a contract or I'll try something in this other space I know nothing about, either to learn from it or to challenge myself. That could be an interesting way to think of it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's the way to look at it. I mean, often the jobs I've taken in UX UI design, I've kind of covered every field now. It seems like, and so I'm gravitating now towards jobs and like, oh, I haven't done anything in that space. Like, I'd love to do something. Like, give me a challenge.
Yeah, exactly. You want to kind of keep growing. Well, It's been really great to have you on, Andy. How can people find you? What's a good place to start, or a few places that you really hang out the most?
Sure. And again, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to be on the podcast. So some places to find me. My website's one, which is andymcnally.com. And of course, it's kind of the hub out to everything else. I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and it's just my name. It's Andy McNally altogether, or my handles for both Instagram and Twitter. And then not new, but I'm kicking it back off again in the next week, is the newsletter, which is the name of the newsletter is the Art Crusade, because it's sort of a not too far off from Sketchnote Army too, but it's sort of that crusade to make art and have our work seen as artists, and obviously that covers sketchnotes and stuff like that. But that's on Substack. You can find links to it on my website in the links there, but you can also find it in the Linktree links from my social media too as well. So it's there. But yeah, those are the key places.
Great. Well, you've heard, if you've not seen Andy's work, you need to go check it out. It's really cool. I appreciate you so much, Andy. All the work that you've done, your consistency, the style that you present, which is so different from so many other people. I appreciate that uniqueness and your perspective. And you always make me smile when I look at these, because I'm often watching these highly edited things, and being able to summarize that on a page is really nice. I mean, if you actually look at what Apple's been doing, they've been doing these one-pagers around products. I don't know if you've seen this, where they try to encapsulate the features on a single slide. So you're sort of maybe a pioneer in that way, and I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've gotten better at putting it on one page. I think some of the first Apple keynotes were sometimes 4 pages.
Yeah,
because it was
so much. But, yeah.
But thank you. Yeah, and likewise, again, thank you, as I mentioned earlier, the space for all of us as sketchnoters to come together and paving the way for us and giving us the community to find one another and interact. And thank you for inspiring us. I mean, like, I see all the stuff that you do with your books and with your ongoing teaching, which is just amazing. And your support of the community. I can't say thank you enough. Like, you've allowed me to find so many other sketchnoters out there by lifting their voices up and making us aware of them. And so it's wonderful to have an advocate like you in the space for us all. So thank you for having me, and thank you for supporting us all.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's really kind of you. And for those who are listening or watching, this is another episode of the Sketchnote Army Podcast. Until the next episode, we'll talk to you then. The Sketchnote Army Podcast was created by me, Mike Rohde, and brought to you by Rohde Design Studios. It's produced and edited by Alec Polianis of AMP Creative Studios. The theme music was created by John Schiedermeyer. To support the creation of this show, I invite you to buy one of my books, the Sketchnote Handbook or the Sketchnote Workbook. You can find the books on Amazon or go to peachpit.com and use the code RODIE40 for 40% off. Please share this podcast with other visual thinking friends and be sure to leave a nice rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast listening app so others can find the show.